Okay, welcome everybody to our session called The Dark Side of M&E. All right. So my name is Carlos Miranda, and I'm going to be the moderator today. Before I get started, I want to introduce myself, lay out some ground rules, and we're going to do a little audience participation. Apologies for the people in the room that hate audience participation, but like I said yesterday, I'm American, I love audience participation. So it is audience participation. I will call on several people, so be ready, don't fall asleep. So a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Carlos Miranda, and I am the CEO and founder of IG Advisors. IG is a strategy and management consultancy focused on the social impact space. We provide philanthropy advice to individuals, families, and foundations, corporate impact consultancy to companies, and fundraising and management consultancy to charities and social enterprises. Our clients include the Gates Foundation, St. Paul's Cathedral, Andrea Coleman at Writers for Health, and like I said yesterday, I'm supposed to say that she's my favorite client. So she's my favorite client. So that's me in a nutshell. A little bit of housekeeping. I have a long list here. Please make sure that all of your cell phones are silent. Feel free. Yesterday, one cell phone went off, and it was one of the panelists. So panelists, please make sure. Feel free to use the social media sites throughout the session. Obviously, the hashtag is #SkollWF. Direct attendees to continue the conversation sparked in this session at the URL on the session slide. Is there a session slide? Oh, look, there we go. Okay. And we're announcing that this session is being filmed, so if somebody has a problem, make sure that you're out of the line of sight. If you have the Skoll World Forum mobile app, please check into this session. Open the mobile app, search for the title of this session, and once you're on the page, click the arrow on the right and press check-in, okay? Yes, and this is also being live streamed. That I didn't know. Okay, the pressure's on, guys. So, some audience participation. This is going to be a little raise your hand type of thing. If you had to pick one and only one of the following two statements, please raise your hand. Here we go. So statement number one, M&E is essential and useful. And statement number two is going to be M&E is a necessary evil. So raise your hand. Essential and useful. Okay. Necessary evil. All right. More than yesterday. All right. Okay. Andy, I know you, so sorry. What percentage, say your name, introduce yourself, what organization, and what percentage of your organization's budget would you say goes to M&E?
Okay.
Ballpark it.
My name's Andrew Webb. I'm CEO of Solar Aid, which owns Sunny Money, the largest retail and distributor of solar lights in Africa. I would say we're close to 20% of our UK budget on monitoring and evaluation, but that goes into research and impact evaluation.
Right, okay. Who else would like to volunteer and tell us how much they spend? I will call on people, so somebody raise their hands, please. No one? Okay, well, you need to help me, guide me a little bit. So, who here works at a charity or social enterprise? Please raise your hand. Okay, who here would describe the organization they work for, they represent as a donor? So are they foundation, donor? Okay. Okay. Next question is RCTs. How much have you guys spent on an RCT? What's an RCT?
A random control trial.
Tell us a little bit about an RCT, Andrea, and how much you guys spend.
Okay. Well, on random controlled trials evaluation, we haven't spent anything, but the Gates Foundation, we're very fortunate to say, did fund a study that was done by Stanford on a random control trial study, and that means, in the case of our work, that certain areas of the country that was being studied were examined for how well healthcare was delivered when there were no managed vehicles, and in the in the experimental districts, how did it affect the health system, the Ministry of Health budgets and community and health workers? How did it help them to have well-managed, well-run vehicles to enable them to access the most remote communities? And so that was the control. One was an experimental district, and there were four experimental districts and 4 control districts.
And how much money was that?
Just over $2 million
Just over
for
2
4
million.
years, 4-year study.
Martin, what about you?
Well, we haven't quite done a randomized control trial, but we've done something very close to that. We initially went out and raised $700,000 for it. We put out a tender for some consultants to come and do it, and they helped us to actually figure out that budget. We were very ambitious across Kenya and Tanzania, and you'll hear in a minute what we actually do. They ran out of money. We ran out of money on this trial, and about halfway through it, we were going to visit 3,900 farmers multiple times. And so then we had to go out and raise a bunch more money and actually bring in different consultants, because these ones were now out of the way. They had other work. Overall, it was about 1.3 million, and it's not finished yet. But yesterday we did hear stories of people who had spent as much as $5 million on an RCT, and I personally know people who have spent well over $3 million on randomized control trials.
The people in the room, raise your hand. Have you guys been involved with RCTs? Okay, so a nice amount. Has anybody been involved with an RCT that's cost more than, say, $3 million? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I've also been involved with one that was free.
Oh, let's talk about $3 million. All right.
Well, so the key feature of a randomized control trial is that you have 2 groups. One gets intervention A and one gets intervention B. Intervention A or B may be nothing, right? But it doesn't have to be a choice between something and nothing. It can be a choice between something and something else. And they are sometimes very expensive because if the outcome that you are looking for takes a long time to appear, for example, if you are tracking the effect of early years education on a person's lifetime earnings, then you have no choice but to follow those people up for a long time. So it can take a long time, but that's got nothing to do with it being a randomized control trial. That's just because the outcome takes a long time. I mean, it tends to be that people who do RCTs think about them rigorously and properly, and so tend to want to follow up properly. They can be free because, so for example, Ian Chalmers, who lives in this town, got a knighthood for setting up a thing, and he wondered whether his knighthood would make any difference to whether people responded to him. So his letters were, by random assignment, signed either Ian Chalmers or Sir Ian Chalmers. And there's 2 groups, right, and it was by random assignment, and they just monitored, A, whether people responded, and B, the time they took to respond. So in that case, it was free because, you already notice whether people are looking at your letters, right? So they have this funny myth that they're terribly expensive, and it's rubbish. So the UK government, the US government, and others now often do RCTs of public policy interventions where they are using, for measuring the outcomes, they're using administrative data that they are collecting anyway. And so the cost of the RCT can be literally nil or less than nil. It can save money often.
Interesting. All right. One more ground rule. I'm going to turn it over to the panel here in a second to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work. I will then ask several questions. We want to make sure that the session is interactive. So if you have something to say, if you have a question, we will have the last 20 minutes or so where we'll do a more kind of informal and proper Q&A and discussion. But if during the panelists, during our talk with the panelists, if you have a comment, if you want to push back, if you want to question what they're saying, please raise your hand and I will call on you. So with that said, Martin, why don't we start with you? Why don't you please introduce yourselves and what you do?
Sure, my name's Martin Fisher, and I run an organization called Kickstart International, and we have a simple mission to enable millions of smallholder farmers in Africa to make a lot more money. And it turns out by far the best way for them to make a lot more money is to move away from rain-fed agriculture, where they all plant their crop at the same time, all harvest at the same time, sell into a very crowded market, where in fact they don't sell all their crop, and up to 50-60% of it goes bad and spoiled before it is sold or eaten. And 4, 5, 6 months later, everybody is hungry and the price of food is very high. Move away from that to irrigated agriculture, because with irrigation, they now bring out crops in the dry season when their price is high and they make a lot of money. Only 4% of the cropland in sub-Saharan Africa is irrigated, compared to say 35% in India. So it's absolutely huge potential, because in the dry season, 4% of the land is feeding the whole continent. And so is the hunger in Africa, of course. Anyway, so what we do is we sell human-powered irrigation pumps to these very small farmers, and they use them to irrigate in the dry season and make a lot of money. We use donor funds to educate the farmers about irrigation and to market these pumps and to get that behavior change of a farmer going from rain-fed to irrigated agriculture, which it turns out is quite a difficult thing when you're dealing with the poorest, most remote, most risk-averse people in the world. Just let me say very quickly about impacts. I believe in impact monitoring for really 3 reasons. One is, frankly, this is hard work, and I don't want to be doing it if we don't have impacts. I would just as soon go home and do something else if there's no impact. So just for us at Kickstart, we want to know that we're having impact. So it's very important that we measure these impacts. Secondly, of course, we need to talk to our customers and find out if we actually are having impacts, and talk to the customers. We can improve the way that we provide goods and services to those customers by talking to them. And thirdly, of course, is donors also want to know about impacts, and so if we can have studies that show our impacts, then they, of course, prefer to fund Kickstart. So we absolutely do impact monitoring, but yeah, that's what I want to say. Yeah.
Andrea?
Yes, I'm Andrea Coleman, co-founder and CEO of Riders for Health. Riders is an organisation that focuses on the management of vehicles, motorcycles and ambulances in the main, to enable healthcare to reach rural communities in Africa who are very hard to reach, mainly because there's lack of infrastructure, often no roads, certainly no fuel, and no service stations. So it's to create an infrastructure to manage the vehicles that can ensure that health workers reach those rural communities is really essential. What's interesting about it, it also creates employment, because we're training young men and women to maintain vehicles, to do all the things that you need to run vehicles, like stores management, fuel management, and all the things all those sort of bog standard things that we all know get done somehow behind the scenes, and all our vehicles run, but it doesn't happen in Africa, and it certainly doesn't happen in rural areas, and therefore people die of easily preventable and curable disease. So we spend almost all our donor money on making sure that people are trained, highly trained, making sure that we are able to talk to ministries of health to enable them to see that working with us will help them with their budgets, enable them to reach their rural communities, and also to underpin an effective health system. Comments on monitoring and evaluation. We believe, of course, that collecting data is vital. Vehicles are counting machines, so we're lucky in that way. They count everything. They count the miles. We know how much we put in, fuel we put in, and how much we've spent on the vehicles, and how far they go, and so on. So we're lucky in that regard, and we have to do evaluation to make sure that we know we're doing a good job in terms of efficiency of the vehicles and effectiveness. So we're looking at that from an operational point of view, but we think it's vital to show what kind of impact that has on health systems. But just to bring in the dark side piece for us, people are very keen for us to say that we affect people's health. Well, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, we think that we use other people's evidence to show that if people have access to healthcare, they are likely to have much better health. So we try to say that is the case, rather than saying we made sure these people didn't die. But, it's an attribution-contribution question. I have other dark side comments to make, but I'll make them later.
Ehren?
So I'm Ehren Reed, Director of Evaluation at the Skoll Foundation, which means that I help the foundation define what success means for us and measure our performance against that success, which in large part means that I work closely with the 91 organizations that we've given the Skoll Award to help understand what success means for them, help define what success means for them, and to negotiate the conversation between us, the foundation, and those, the awardees. As you can probably discern from my title, I'm a believer in evaluation of M&E. I like to think, I guess, to play off of the title, you can think of me maybe as Yoda, like the small, grizzly-haired, big-eared fellow who recognizes the dark side exists, but is trying to make sure that we're all on the side of good. Jedi warriors.
Yeah. How do we follow that? We should all just go home now. So Martin, Andrea, let's start with you guys. Let's start on the good side of M&E. I'd love to hear an example, maybe, Andrea, why don't we start with you? A very tangible example of when M&E has really kind of worked in your favor at Riders.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question because certain kinds of evaluation only express, in a way, what is obvious. You know, many people who know the work of Riders for Health would say, well, that's really what this study shows is kind of obvious. But of course, one of the things we're really trying to do all the time is to influence ministries of health and influence the people who fund African ministries of health to take up what we do. So it's very important to have robust information that shows them how it affects health systems and budgeting and so on. So our Stanford study has certainly been useful in that regard, although it shows other people, well, yeah, we knew that already. So that's one thing. But we also do our own evaluation to see what cost every single intervention. What is the cost of every single intervention? For example, if we're doing sample transport for diagnosis of a disease, what does it cost for one sample to be collected, taken to a clinic, and return the report? And we know that if we get that figure, we can think about how you reduce that cost for every single intervention. So that's a very, very useful tool for us. And it may turn out, in the first place, that is that's quite a high cost. And so our job then is, how do you reduce that? How do you make it more impactful for less money?
Great. Martin?
Yeah, so like I say, I'm a strong believer in impact evaluation and measurement. So we built it into our program way back, starting in 1998, in terms of an internal capacity in order to be able to measure key impacts. But one thing to remember is we've defined our primary thing that we're trying to do is enable a lot of people, millions of people, to make a lot more money. So that becomes our key indicator that we're going to be measuring. And we do this in-house because what we actually do, as I said, is we sell human-powered irrigation pumps, very low-cost irrigation pumps to smallholder farmers. We sell through a network of retail dealers. We get a guarantee form because they have a guarantee on the pump. So we get a guarantee form every time somebody buys a pump. We get a database as a result. We randomly select people. We go visit them when they first buy a pump. We talk about their previous year's income, measure that, and a lot of other questions. Come back 18 months later and 36 months later. So we can really track the changes in income. And we've seen very big impacts. We've sold a 250,000 pumps. And we know that 850,000 people have taken a major step out of poverty as a result, but also huge impacts on health, education, housing, nutrition, all sorts of other things that come when you make more money. And how has this helped us? Well, of course, it's kept us on the job because, like I say, we needed to know that we're having impacts to even do the work as far as I'm concerned. But it's also guided our programs. For example, we launched one particular pump a number of years ago that we thought would sell like hotcakes, and it was a very low-cost pump, and in fact it did. But then we started doing a study and we realized, yes, it sold very, very well, but actually nobody was making any money from it. So to the disappointment of our sales staff, we withdrew it off decided not to sell it anymore, and we modified it so it would actually start to make more money for people. So actually, guided what we do in terms of the lessons. And then certainly us being able to talk about impacts, and we've been doing it, like I said, all the way back from 1999, so for a long time. It means that we have a reputation amongst donors as an impact-driven organization that is serious about our impacts, and absolutely being able to show those numbers, regular studies has helped us to raise money, no doubt about it.
Great. Ehren, or should I say Yoda, as the sole donor on the panel, tell us a little bit about when an M&E report kind of gets you and the team at Skoll really excited and saying, wow, this is just amazing, and kind of what are the attributes that you guys look for?
Well, actually, I'd reframe the question just a little bit, because I think the anchoring on a report as the beginning of that conversation is part of where I get a little worried.
Sure, fair enough.
And I'll say a little bit more about that. It would have been helpful if I had used alliteration to nail some of these points, but I didn't. Instead, I used a common suffix for each of the themes, so bear with me. These are my I's. First, I think it's helpful when I can see clearly how the work is contextualized within their efforts. So there needs to be a clear description of the intended goals of an organization, whether it's a theory of change or Kevin Starr's at Malago Foundation's 10-word mission statement, a clear, communicable description of what you're trying to do, the actions that you're doing that would lead to that. I want to very clearly intuit how those metrics that you're sharing with me connect with that core strategy. That should be very apparent to me. That makes me feel good. The second is prioritize. That there is a whole ton of things that you could be measuring, that the fact that you've gone through an exercise to winnow it down to the few that you think are most important to tell your story, I find to be a good sign in an organization. It shows a process of thought process that goes into the identification of meaningful measures. On that note, those measures should be influenced by what you are able to do with that information. As Andrea was describing, that you use these cost efficiency metrics for a purpose inside the foundation. If you are collecting something that you are not making use of, stop collecting that piece of information. You're wasting time and money. The third is capitalize. And I think of Caroline Fiennes here. There is a ton of work that's been done before to answer a number of questions. Don't answer a question that you need not answer. There's probably certain outcomes, certain indicators that are critical to your theory of change, critical to the work that you do. Those that are more attributable to your efforts, the ones that you can claim were brought about as a result of your work. There are others that at best you're going to be able to say that we made a contribution to those efforts as you move down the theory of change. Concentrate on the ones that are attributable. Leave alone the ones that are farther down. I can think of, I see Eric Schwartz, Citizen Schools, in the room. He can tell a very compelling story about how Citizen Schools increases the graduation rates of students that attend by 20% over a control. That's the compelling story I need to know from them. I don't need to know whether or not that leads to greater income generation once they've graduated from high school, because there are studies that already show me that. So leave that alone. It's the same, I would argue, for Riders for Health, that they can prove to me that their work leads to greater health access. They don't need to tell me, they don't need to prove to me that that leads to greater health outcomes, because we already have studies that have shown that. So be efficient with the way that you're spending your dollars. The fourth is right size. Different people at different levels of an operation need to know different pieces of information. And so at 1 Acre Fund, which is a robust internal management monitoring and evaluation system, that the workers in the field working directly with the farmers will be paying attention to things like which farmers are attending certain trainings, what kind of uptake are they having for particular techniques that are being taught, what kind of repayment rates. That's the information that they need to know in order to know whether or not they're doing their job more effectively. As it rolls up through the organization, middle managers are looking at aggregated data. They're looking at certain pieces of information. The leadership are looking at only a key set of performance indicators, probably the same ones that are then communicated out to 1 Acre Fund's core donors. Different people pay attention to different pieces of information, so right size your approach accordingly. And then all of these are in the spirit of my fifth I's, which is systematize. That, in my mind, evaluation, the whole idea that we talk about M&E as a separate thing gives me pause. The idea that we think about it as like a report that you submit as like a separate operation within your work, I think is a dangerous misnomer, that it needs to be part and parcel of your programmatic activity. So When I meet an organization that focuses more on M&E for marketing and communication purposes, that gives me pause. If a communications team spends more time with an organization's data than their program team does, that gives me pause. If it's all focused on a report that comes out once a year and there's not a lot behind the scenes leading up to that report, that gives me pause. That it has to be part and parcel of your operation. I think about like the example of a basketball player. So let's say you've got a basketball player. She thinks every day after a game is over about the shots that she missed and about the rebounds that she had and the assists that she made. And she reflects on how she could do a better job on that the next game. And then maybe once every 4 years, 5 years, she's negotiating a new contract with a new team, and she packages that information up in a certain way that it sounds sexy and cool. But that's built on the back of days worth of tracking of information that allowed her to be the proficient basketball player that allowed her to be sitting at that table in the first place. Or like a car, that you're looking at a dashboard every day that you're in the car, that those are metrics that allow you to know whether or not the car's functioning effectively or you're functioning effectively as a driver. But it's only when you get to like the selling of that car that you make the statements about, oh, it gets a lot of miles per gallon and I've only been in 2 accidents and they were minor.
All right, that's a lot of ISs. We have some questions. Sir, anybody want to push back? Please, yeah.
I would love to live in the world you're describing.
Please say your name and the organization.
So I'm Sarah Joy Pond with conveners.org. Hi, Ehren. Hi. We haven't actually met yet. So 100% agree with everything you just said. It does not reflect my reality and my experience, particularly working with funders. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the question that I want to put to you is, you say don't answer a question if it doesn't serve you as an organization. What if my funder makes me ask that question? Yeah. And I have to answer the question. Yeah. But it has no bearing on my work.
So I'll answer it quickly, and I'll certainly allow my panelists, because they answer these questions much more often than I do. We have the luxury at Skoll Foundation of giving in unrestricted support, general operating support to our organizations. We invest in the whole of the organization. That frees us up to have a different conversation around success. We want to know the good, the bad, and generally speaking, how well the organization is doing in all of its efforts. I hope that more funders heading in that direction. I would also raise, there is, in my mind, a fallacy that we propagate within the field of a power dynamic between funders and organizations that says funders have money, and so therefore they have the power, and so we need to kowtow to their work. I would argue that organizations have the impact that funders need in order to achieve what they're hoping for, and especially the organizations that are in this room, that if you can tell a compelling case, that you can clearly back up that your work makes a difference based on the evidence that you've been able to build through your internal system, that in my experience, a funder will allow for that, will make that negotiation. But
these are the questions to answer my...
And defend why you know they work and why you know that they matter. It's my feeling that the burden of negotiation between a set of metrics, if a funder has a set of metrics that they work with already and you have a set that is slightly different, that the burden of negotiation should be on the part of the funder, that they should reconcile that with their metrics, unless you're wrong, and which happens. That you may be using the wrong metric, and that their ability to scan the field, that there is a better metric that has come out that you don't know about yet, and they can infuse that into your efforts.
Andrea, Martin, we'd love to kind of hear your guys' experience with that.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I find really interesting about doing donor reports is that it often gives you the opportunity to think about the unintended consequences. For example, if one of the things we really had never thought about when we first started doing the work of Riders for Health was that if a health worker has a vehicle that's well maintained, a motorcycle that works well and that they know how to ride it, they'll actually do the journeys that they would not have undertaken, either if they were walking or if they think the motorcycle is going to break down. So it has a very big sort of psychological effect on health workers. So I think that one of the great benefits of doing those reports is that it helps you to, it does help you to put down the numbers about we're reaching this number of people, we're doing this number of journeys, we're dealing with these particular health issues with this particular health worker or this cadre of health workers. But it also helps you to really think deeply about, so what does that mean across the whole picture of what you're doing in order to enable the funder, the donor, the partner to really see the full benefit of what's happening. And if you just do the numbers, it doesn't give you that feel, that full picture. And I think that's what reports are helpful for us for and helpful to the partner for.
Martin?
Yeah, and so as I said, we sort of got this reputation for being impact driven and for having an internal capacity to measure impact. And since a lot of organizations, at least starting back in 1999, and it's more likely that people do presently, but not all organizations have that. And so donors would get very excited about that. But so much so that they would say, look, we might become a big donor to you, but initially we want to start off with a small grant to you. So we're going to give you a $100,000 grant, or sometimes even a $50 grant, but don't worry, we might become very big. But guess what? We want you to measure your impacts for that $100,000 grant. And do an internal study and prove that we have impacts. And we're only going to give you funding for 1 year. In fact, we're really interested in the empowerment of women. So we want you to measure your impacts on the empowerment of women from these irrigation pumps, which we know increase family income. They're hanging out there and saying, okay, well, yes, maybe there's $1 million down the road here. And of course, doing a study like that, yes, we could do it because we have the internal study, although within a year you're not going to measure much because we know that the real impacts of this pump aren't going to be felt, until at least probably a year and a half, 2 years, all our studies show. But what happened, we started accepting some challenges like this, and we found our impact monitoring team was spending all their time measuring little impact for particular donors on fairly small grants, as opposed to what we set it up for initially, which was to do a systematic, once every 18 months or so, go out there and do a systematic study of our overall impacts. Instead, we were going to one little part of Kenya where a donor had given us this initial grant. And so I think it's really, yes, they would write some of the cost into that grant, but usually only direct costs. And actually impact monitoring, especially of a slightly different type, it ends up costing you a huge amount of time in management and all sorts of other costs, which are kind of hidden costs, not to mention the opportunity cost, which not only their money could have done much more work, but the management time could have done much more work in terms of having other impacts. So I think this is fairly common in the field where donors get excited about impact monitoring. Oh, great, well, we're going to give you this grant and you go out and measure the impact. And it's like, wait a minute, we've done a lot of studies. Why don't you believe all these other studies that, yes, when somebody makes more money, it empowers women because we can show you we've done this study and this study, as opposed to saying they want their own study. Anyway, so that's certainly something that happens, and it's very disrupting, like I say, when that happens, you go down that path.
Yes. That well.
So a question for Martin, what did you do or what do you now do with those requests?
Yeah.
Well, so now we are starting to tell donors, look, sorry, we're not going to do a separate study for you unless you give us very significant grants over a significant amount of time. But still, if somebody's saying, okay, I want to give you a $1 million grant, if you put in this little bit of extra impact study, which might be 50,000, 100,000 of that, it's still a very tough decision. Do you turn down that $1 million grant if they say this is absolutely necessary? So we would still do it for a large enough grant, to be honest.
So we're talking really about kind of pushing back, saying to donors and having, saying no to a lot of money potentially. You guys are well established. You have a lot of fantastic donors. You've been around for a while. You have these reports. I think that many people would see here that maybe you're in a better position than a startup, right? What if you're only 2 years in? Mm-hmm. Would your advice be any different? I'd love to kind of hear it from all of you. If you're actually a younger organization, one that is, trying to still prove their model, trying to scale, early years, how do you say no to a donor? How do you push back?
To me, when you're a startup, you have to define what your key impact is. In our case, it's that poor people make more money. And you have to be able to define your one or two key impacts that you're trying to create. And of course, you have to show your theory of change and why you think this is going to happen. But it's also important as a startup organization to actually establish internal methodology, so you are, of course, talking to your beneficiaries and determining, well, are they actually making more money, or are you actually having these impacts? It might not be statistically valid, but at least you've got to be out there talking to your beneficiaries, because otherwise you've got to change what you're doing if they're not having impacts. Then I say you have to just convince your donor, look, this is my theory of change, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what the feedback from the field says, we're still too young to have go out and do an impact study at this point, because we're still modifying what we're doing. We haven't even got it right ourselves. That's why we're talking to our beneficiaries. And I think actually many donors who are funding startups don't care that much about doing detailed impact studies, from what I've heard. In fact, I had one donor the other day I was talking to, and he funds a lot of startups, and he actually said, doing an impact study is just a waste of time and money. What we want to hear as a startup is your story and your theory of change and the proof. So hopefully for startups it's not a huge issue. But certainly when you start to scale up it is. And one of the pushbacks we get is, you guys are measuring your own scorecard here. This internal stuff, we don't want to hear about that internal impact monitoring. Even though we had a PhD economist on staff and we were doing it properly. And then there becomes a push. What we want to see is an RCT. What we want to see is a large RCT. And maybe we're not actually capable to fund that for you, but we want you to do one before we decide to fund you with a lot more money. And that was, about, like I said earlier, about 5-6 years ago, when it was really just the beginning of RCTs getting popular. We actually went out and did decide to fund ourselves, from donors of course, but to fund this very large study, which then I described earlier, ran into one problem after another. And RCTs, of course, have major limitations also, which most researchers don't admit to. And I could go down a list of them, but I won't. But I think it's important that donors understand the fundamental limitations of RCTs in terms of actually giving a right result, and the kinds of things you can and can't measure. But.
Andrea?
I think one of the issues that I believe is critical about measurement and exploring and examining both your organization and its impact is to recognize what the timeline is likely to be. Because I think as Martin says, that over a 1-year period of any grant, it's going to be very difficult to show a big sort of outcome, but nevertheless, along that pathway, you can as long as you're presenting a realistic picture of what's likely to happen year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and so on. I think that's absolutely legitimate and something, because time, everything with social enterprises takes so much longer than any other business. The outcomes are much harder to gather and they're harder to make happen. And in our case, some of our most successful programs, for example, in the Gambia, we've had great success over a 4-year period in terms of a loan and paying it back and the great health impact. But it took nearly 13 years to get the Ministry of Health to actually sign up to it and to understand that this was going to be transformative. So I think for new organizations, for startups, I just think it's important for the partners within it, the organization, their partners, to understand what it is you're trying to, what you're likely to achieve in the first year, second year, and third year, and so on, so that you can have a realistic measurement, rather than expecting at the end of a year or 2 years to come out and say, I've saved this number of people. So I just think that there has to be a discussion between the partner and the partners to make sure that the expectations are set. And when you're a startup, it's really proving the concept much more than showing considerable impact. Is this likely to turn into something that is going to have the impact you believe it's going to have? So I think it's just setting realistic expectations. And I think if we as organizations overpromise about what could be done in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and then we're unable to report that, and we should have said, you'll see this in 8 years. We should say, you're going to see this in 8 years. We shouldn't unset unrealistic expectations in order to draw a donor in. So I think that sort of covers we old guys and also startups.
Yeah, and I think that final point is very important, is that social impacts, when you're trying to get behavior change, which is really what we're all trying to do, behavior change takes a long time. And you don't, when you're starting something new, you don't expect to see things just take off. It's not like Facebook doing this. When you're doing social behavior change, it takes off very, very, very slowly. And then maybe, as you say, 20, 30 years later, you suddenly it all happens. And donors have to understand that too.
I see a lot of questions on it, but before we turn it over to Ehren, what about you? I'd love to kind of hear, how can somebody, as a donor, how can somebody push back in a way, like very tangibly? What do you think? How would you like to be pushed back?
How would I like to
Gently.
be? Oh, yeah,
Gently,
please.
gently.
Don't knock me over.
Yeah.
No, I think just it's negotiation. I think that's the point. Is it's not pushback. It's not you're wrong. It's that you're both coming from a perspective where you think you have the right measure. If you are convinced that you have the better measure, convince the other audience that you do. But if you're a younger organization, you may not know what the right measure should be, and so feel free to welcome the input of a funder who may think that that has the perspective, who has worked with other organizations and thinks that they have a measure that would be useful to you. But then also negotiate not only on the content of what you're measuring, negotiate on the cost of what it takes to measure. Yeah. That's not always factored in and shouldn't be factored into a $50,000 grant, or should be factored in as part and parcel of the grant, rather than spend $20,000 of this $50,000 explicitly on a separate study to study the $30,000 that you spent on work.
Right. All right, we see a lot of questions. Please introduce yourself.
Alison Hewitt from the Mars Center in Toronto, Canada. I'm interested in how we can better share what is working, or what are some standard metrics so that we all don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. So if you have any platforms or anything you're familiar with, if you could share it with this group, that would be great.
My question was in this exact direction.
Yeah,
You just
please.
My name is Andrea, and I'm from São Paulo, Brazil, and I'm with the Association of Foundations in Brazil. So my perspective shifts a bit from the relation of funder and donor. And my question was related to sharing. To what extent one organization can benefit from an evaluation report? And I can see some benefits of that, but I also can see some limitations, considering the large amount of effort that's put into understanding in a specific context and how that's affecting that particular intervention. So is it something worth investing, and what advice would you have?
Who'd like to tackle that?
Well, I do think that there needs to be much more of a conversation between donors and organisations about this measurement, what it is that's going to be, what's realistic, and what is what the donors' goal is, and what the organisation's goal is, and to make sure they are in those terms aligned, and so on. But I do also think that there has to be a conversation about almost a bigger conversation about, in our case it's health that keeps it relatively narrow, and vehicles, and in Martin's it's water pumps and water and irrigation and so on, and poverty. But I think the conversation between the donor and the organisation has to be a bit broader about what you're actually trying to change about not make it so broad, we want to change the world and between us we can, but I think there has to be a broader conversation about what you're trying to achieve and how long it might take to do that, and what measurements you can put in place to show that those changes seem to be taking place. So I in a way, it's not so much about the monitoring and evaluation, it's having a better conversation between donors and the funders to make sure that they are aligned and they really feel that they can do this together.
Martin, anything to add?
No, I'm not sure in your question whether you're thinking about what methods of impact monitoring, or what tools, or
Stuff that the next person can benefit from, and so how is that being shared?
how do organizations that are doing impact monitoring share what they're doing and how they do it?
Right, so if I'm dealing with particular... So if I'm dealing with a particular issue and I've got a particular way of solving, like what are those like 5 metrics, not 5,000 metrics that we think, many of us could be sharing and learning from instead of replicating or, trying to figure it all out for ourselves. When we know those have gone ahead of us, we'll have a lot of learnings.
Sort of the key performance indicators in a way. Right, okay.
So yeah, I'll tackle this a little bit. First off, not nearly enough, and we probably all know that. The field does not share as much as it should. There's a variety of ways I think that this could improve. Funders, for one, have the luxury of doing a little bit of sharing. It's easier, I say funders have the luxury because it's a little bit easier for them, it's a little bit lower risk to share that information. And so we at Skoll partner closely with friendly funders to talk about what do you know about this organization. That way I don't need to ask that same question and burden them with that information or that request for information. We often gladly accept a report that was packaged for another funder as a report to the Skoll Foundation, so long as it meets our needs for information. Don't write a new report for us if you're just going to answer the outcomes that we've already agreed upon anyway, especially with a funder that's close to us, so we have a shared definition of success across all the different institutions. That's one way to do it. It's harder, I acknowledge, for organizations to collaborate in that way because of the dynamic of asking for money. You don't want to share too much lest you come off, or there's a risk of using too many common outcomes, too many common metrics, that you come off looking less good compared to an alternative. And I recognize that exists. It's just, it is there, and it is it prevents us from sharing as much. One solution to that is, I think I'm happy with paradoxes. My mind works well with opposing ideas. The field requires both common metrics and custom metrics. That every one of us, every organization doing work, has its own approach that at some point connects to a common set of outcomes. That you can have differentiation at the same time as common metrics. That no one metric is going to tell me that an organization is successful. It always involves some combination of variables. And so if you don't look so good on one metric, that doesn't mean that you're not successful or less successful than this other organization. I need to see the full picture. I need to take into account context. I need to take into account a variety of different factors.
Wait for the mic. Hold on 1 second before somebody screams at me.
Hi, I'm Jason Saul with Mission Measurement. Hi, camera. How you doing? To this question of common metrics and how do we get the answers, I look at this on 2 levels. One, there is a tremendous amount of reinventing the wheel, and if you look at each organization as its own independent entity, then yes, we need sui generis, a different evaluation for every single one of us. But if you look at every organization, even in this room, as aiming at, as Ehren said, at a common set of outcomes, and our research shows there are only 132 common outcomes in the entire social sector. We're all trying to empower women, reduce the incidence of youth violence, increase jobs, earnings. There's only so many things we're trying to do. If you look at all the research for each one of those outcomes and tease out the factors that are associated with an effect size, you can create a predictive model. And that's one of the things we're doing with something called the Impact Genome Project. But that is the answer. Whoever does it, it is ridiculous for us to continue to do this. When someone gives someone a vaccine for a flu, we don't keep reevaluating every single flu shot that we give somebody. We test a set of people, and then anyone who gives flu shots anywhere in the world, we know what the outcome's going to be, generally. And so I think we have to get to that point, and I would say it's unacceptable for us not to. There's only about 35,000 RCTs that have ever been done in the social sector, and it's just not that hard to codify that. So that is what we're doing, but that is inevitable. So that's a statement, I guess, not a question.
Thanks. Let's talk a little bit about the dark side of M&E. Andrea, let's start with you. When is it just counterproductive? When does it just not work?
Well, I'm not sure that I'd quite put it that way. I think that the things that worry me or Riders for Health about M&E are One of them is that we believe that it's important for each of our programs, we're in 7 African countries, to have an M&E person, a local person, to do that work, because they're obviously looking at the organisation for our own improvement, but also to report on outcomes and impact and so on. And we keep on training really, really good local monitoring and evaluation people. And every single time a bigger organisation, wealthier organisation comes along and pinches them. And then we have to train somebody else. And that's quite a challenge, because it is difficult to find people already trained who are local to do that work. So I think a little bit of work needs to be done on larger numbers of people in developing countries to do monitoring and evaluation, and it doesn't have to be a huge academic study or a person who's an academic. It just needs somebody to know what we're collecting or the organisation's collecting. I think another very difficult thing for us is that we work in Lesotho, and one of the study, the Gates-Stanford study, was done in Zambia, and Lesotho just said, if it's not done in Lesotho, we're not looking at it. It's just not relevant to us. Well, we know it is. So that's another difficult thing that that's the Ministry of Health. So there are you can do these randomized controlled trials, and you can do all the work you like, but actually sometimes people really want it to be so specific to them that it makes it very difficult, or almost, you almost think, oh, well, was that worthwhile, because, nobody in another country is going to take any notice of it. I think on the side of randomized control trials, I am concerned about the ethics of it, of doing, enabling some people who live quite close to each other to be much healthier, and other people to not be healthy. And I think there is an ethical question that I think we all need to explore. But just going back very briefly to the discussion between donors, we had a grant from the Elton John Foundation to work in Lesotho. And they had never really done robust monitoring evaluation, and neither had we. And we actually, between us, figured out that we didn't quite know what we were going to come up with, but we knew some of the things that we both needed to see. And having that conversation really, we learned a lot, and they learned a lot about how you take that forward. So I definitely think that conversation between the two partners can be really, really helpful and creative, and come up with something that's powerful and useful.
Martin?
Well, I described the pressure we get from donors to do an impact monitoring study when they give you a fairly small amount of money, and that was a big problem. And the other one is the big push to the RCTs. And it's interesting with RCTs. I mean, I think we've taken RCTs from the medical field, where they really are fairly scientific, even though even in the medical field they're not always right. But they really are pretty scientific. And we've taken that over to the social field, where actually they're not nearly as scientific, and there's all sorts of challenges. For example, we sell our products to farmers. And if you're doing an RCT, it's very hard to get a control group who didn't buy, because someone who didn't buy and someone who did buy are, by definition, very different people. So who is the control when you're controlling when you sell a product or service? Who's the control group? But then you have,
your service isn't giving a thing to someone, it's offering it.
No, I understand, but if only 5% of the, or 2% of the people buy, that means you have to measure a huge number of people to make it happen, especially then you have to measure community level changes. So there's all sorts of challenges on how to do this without getting the cost to be extremely expensive. And then long-term impacts, yes, you can measure long-term impacts, but that's a huge, long study. And the donors aren't going to wait until 30 years to see if this person got a better job 30 years from now as a result of this. If you're doing, children at birth or something, before they decide whether they fund you or not. You have to wait till they become adults. Anyway, so there's other challenges with it. Of course, what it does is it measures a very specific impact at a particular case in a particular location, particular time. But generally, the other thing as I've looked around these studies, very often what you're measuring is something which is different than the actual implementation, which is common. So for us, when people want to do RCTs with us, they always say, well, why don't we just give away the pumps? You know, we give away the pumps to these people, not those people. But in all other cases that I've heard about, it's also not actually the way the organization works, which when you're designing it for a test. So you're testing something. I mean, I could go on with other things. All the biases which are there, which you don't have in a drug trial. There's systematic biases on interviewee bias, on enumerator bias that no one ever talks about, and you need a huge number of enumerators to get around that. And the fact that when you go to a rural place and you're the enumerator, you're out there trying to meet the farmer, and you're trying to meet the same person in the family who you met 18 months ago or 2 years ago. You probably don't, or it's very hard to meet that same person. So what do? And you're under time pressure to finish that particular interview in that day. What actually happens out there in the field? Very hard to check on did they make up the numbers or not. You can try, but it's very, very difficult. And then other things they very often don't do is measure the cost effectiveness. And the other thing they don't do is measure the sustainability of impacts. They measure the impacts today. Were those impacts sustainable over time? Or the sustainability of the intervention. Or unintended consequences. So I think, and I'm a big fan of RCTs because it is, quote, the gold standard, although I would probably say it's more like a bronze standard compared to medical. And so we need to do them because it is the best we have, but we also need to understand the limitations of them as we do them and look at the cost benefit, because the costs can be huge. You know, you might be spending $5 million in rural Africa to go out and do an RCT, a large RCT.
So before we turn it over, Ehren, why don't you hear your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just want to elaborate because there's we're, I think, getting caught in one of the traps that I think that we play in as a field, even with this conversation today, that we're talking about. There's a tendency with the evaluation impact assessment conversation to focus on, or to oversimplify and focus on one particular element of the broader measurement conversation at the expense of all the other factors involved. An example would be just to jump to say, to equate that the idea of doing an RCT or is all you need to do. Like, oh, I need to do my impact assessment. I'm going to call up an evaluator, and they're going to come in and do the study, and then I'll get a report, and I'm done. I've satisfied. I've checked that box. We all know that's wrong, but there's a whole number of other ways that we conflate and oversimplify this. There's we're even talking about impact a lot, just the impact assessment side. That's only one factor of what organizations should be measuring, that they should be measuring the past, what's been done so far, the present, the kind of process measures, are you doing a good job right now, and the future of what are you going to do next. Some of the best organizations, or the ones that have the best M&E capacity within our portfolio, are running mini experiments on mini projects that they might do in the future to know whether or not they should do them. That allows them to evolve with the ever-changing world that we live in. Just proving something worked 5 years ago in one location is not going to give you the long legs that you need in order to get to where you need to be 20 years from now, 50 years from now. You need to be constantly moving and constantly evaluating. And we sometimes forget that when we talk about this conversation. We just talk about, prove to me you did something, just the past. The other thing that we do is when we talk about proof, we sometimes talk about one element of that proof. It's far too often that I hear, like, I'm working with 1.5 million people in 72 countries. Okay, that's just one indicator of the story I need to tell. That I need to know not only the reach of your efforts, I need to know the depth of the efforts. What does that mean for every one of those 1.5 million people? How have their lives changed? I need to know who those people are. Are those people that it was really easy to change their lives or really hard to change their lives? Are they hard to reach, or people that were worse off or better off? Did you just move them a little bit because it was the easy, or did you move them a small bit because it was really, really hard? That helps me understand why it's costing what it is costing for your program to do what it's doing. I need to know the context. I need to know which 72 countries. I need to know, I need to know the lasting durability of the change that you brought about. You can't just tell me that they got healthier if they're just going to get unhealthier 2 years later. That it needs to be, you need to be able to tell me over time that this is going to sustain, that the water is going to run when you leave, that the sanitation is going to be there, that they're going to use the toilets once you leave. That's just the direct outcomes of your effort. That's only still one part of what we need to pay attention to. I also want to know what you're doing to change everybody else. If you truly have found the way to make a difference in this world, and you think that the way to change the world is just for you to do it, I would challenge you on that. I would say, what are you doing with government? What are you doing with your peer organizations? What are you doing to shift broader behavior? Because you're one organization, you're only going to be able to have so much of an impact by yourself. And so what kind of systems change efforts do you have in place? And what evidence do you have that that is taking place? All of that is what I need to know whether or not you're successful. You're not going to be able to convince me with just one piece of that story. And too often, because it's difficult, we just simplify and miss the bigger story.
We have a lot of questions. Let's start over here. Let's wait for the mic so the camera can pick it up.
I'm trying to figure out whether I should, it's the other side of the dark side.
Right.
I work for I work for Pratham, which is a NGO in India. We work quite on large scale. And I think that in this conversation, I think it's underlying in this conversation, but we haven't mentioned it, so I thought I would, that there is something about how an organization approaches curiosity, about the context in which you're working and how do you capture that. You can have metrics, you can have impact evaluations, but if you didn't have the curiosity and kind of an inbuilt capability to keep growing that curiosity, all of this measurement kind of falls flat on its face, and then you're doing it for someone else. And in what ways can organizations, and by that I mean whether it's the donor, the implementer, or the evaluator, all of these people, how do you keep growing this curiosity so that each activity that you do actually raises 5 more interesting questions that all of you want to tackle? So I think that if you don't do that, then that side becomes darker. If you do this more, then it becomes lighter. And I think there is something about thinking about who is going to learn what and how can we together learn. And the capability of our learning may be quite basic to begin with, because we're all at a very basic level, and then move in some way together is something that these assessments, so the human dimension of curiosity, I think, underlies a lot of this. That I just thought nobody had said it, so I should say.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Any other questions? Please, in the back.
I wanted to come to a couple of points. Firstly, to Martin Fisher's I'm Paul Montgomery from the Centre for Evidence-Based Intervention here at Oxford. Martin made a few points about randomised trials and their difficulty in this kind of sector, which I'd want to challenge. The conduct of social intervention trials has a long history. Actually, it started in agriculture, where it's very easy to randomise fields, as you might imagine. You can very easily, over the seasons, shift them round, and that's where this whole field began. A site you might enjoy is the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, which has many hundreds of social intervention trials in low and middle income countries listed on it. And my research group has been doing them now for over a decade. I'd like to emphasize that I think evidence-based practice is not just about research and just about randomized trials. And increasingly, evidence is coming out about how we might look at other designs like interrupted time series and regression discontinuities that show that these other designs are as powerful as randomized trials. And I think that's going to be really important for many of the pieces of work that you're doing and many of the sorts of projects that you've been talking about this afternoon. But one thing that I think is really important to get hold of is this ethical question. And I think many groups haven't really even contemplated the ethical question of, are they doing harm? And that's one of the things that randomized trials flush out really well. And some projects don't even want to go there. And the harm question is fundamental, and I think we could do worse than just spend a couple of minutes on that. I was really interested to hear about the Impact Genome Project and this whole issue of duplication, which we've been thinking about. In health and social care, the COMET project has been going now for a number of years. And COMET stands for Core Outcome Measures and Economic Trends, I think it is. So they've been putting together core outcomes that will always be measured when a trial is proposed in a particular area. That's not to say you can't add on other measures, but it's been agreed by people working in those particular areas that you'll always measure those things. And I think that could be really helpful, and something that we might like to think about perhaps here at Skoll is getting people to think about and then produce simple data collection methods that people could have and use easily that would perhaps make life slightly easier. So I hope that's a couple of things that would feed into this.
Yeah, just to respond, I'm, like I said from the very beginning of this conversation, I'm a huge fan of impact measurement. I think it's absolutely critical. I was very excited when the whole field of randomized trials came up in the social sector. People like Michael Kramer have been friends of mine for 30 years. So it's not that I'm against RCTs, and like I say, I think we can't say they're as scientific in the social sector as they are in the medical sector. And they do have limitations in terms of just because they work here, maybe they don't work there, while vaccines, you're pretty sure if they work here, they are going to work somewhere else. Other things are going to be different. And so they do have limitations that I think we need to be aware of. And this is why I'm a big fan of having an internal impact measurement capacity within an organization, precisely so we can do this learning, keep the curiosity going, and do these little tests, as someone else had just referred to, where where you try something and you see did it have an impact or not, right on the bat, instead of waiting until you've scaled it up big enough to do a randomized trial. So just to set that straight, the way I look at it. Yeah.
So we have 5 more minutes. Let's go for 2 more questions. Yeah, so then one.
So my name is Miranda. I'm from the Ministry of Health in Liberia. So just a little bit on the dark side. Most of what we've been speaking about today has been linked to evaluation and donors. I'd like to take you a little bit to the government side. To the panel, do you think, especially in terms of health, we always like to see what investment and the use that we have gotten from an evaluation. Do you think we don't do very well in how we communicate the results of our evaluation to governments, and really trying to convince them that whatever we want to put on the table for them is actually something that's going to be beneficial? So Andrea, I would like to talk to you after. Riders for Health. We've been through an Ebola outbreak. We're talking about Riders for Health and how Riders for Health can help the ministry. But I know there's been debates about, yes, it's worked in other countries, and would it be applicable to the situation in Liberia? So do you think a portion of the dark side is how we communicate our evaluation results?
Great question, Andrea.
Shall I answer
Please,
now?
yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's it's not just because you're here in the room, but actually the conversation and the working with the Ministry of Health in Liberia has been a great experience for us so far, because it's so focused on what it needs to do, and so it comes under the heading of never waste a good crisis, because the Ebola crisis has been so devastating for Liberia and Sierra Leone and other countries, but Liberia are very focused on using that to rebuild and really go forward and take the country forward. So I think that it is true that ministries of health don't really explain or highlight the data collection that they have. And actually it's very interesting, because we've recently been looking at the difference that immunization programs have been working, and because by health workers being mobilized and immunization teams being able to be mobilized, and it's been very difficult to ascertain the difference it's made because of the way that the vaccines are divided so much into very different diseases, which is fine for academia, but actually for something as practical and as kind of, sort of basic as what the things that Riders does, it does make it quite difficult. But I think once again it is a conversation about what the ministry needs to get out of this, and what the organisation needs to provide, and also to get out of it. Because one of the issues about mobility, of course, is that we've found in the other countries that we've worked, that because you have mobility, you're actually able to collect data better. But of course, we also know that now that mobile phones and SMS and other smartphone technology, that may make data easier to collect, but it's still the people who input it, and the health workers are often too busy and have other focuses to input that data. So I would love to have a conversation about M&E and the Liberia program. I have to say, I'd love that.
All right, one last question, and then they're going to kick us out. So please.
With the mic. I'm not convinced I wanted to talk, but I have the mic. So my name is Katie Boram-Chetu. I direct a center in Washington called the Center for Media and Social Impact, and I'm also advisor to Participant Media. I know Ehren, among other media organizations, about evaluating media effects around social change and social impact. And so I'm a strategist who uses research as a tool. And so a lot of times here's what I wanted to contribute, not so much as a question, but maybe as a parting thought to be taken up for another conversation, is the lack of focus in equal conversation around the importance of formative research. So 2 things I want to say about that. So a lot of times I get calls from people who say, we want to know the impact of X story on X thing. And I'll say, let me first talk to you for an hour about what you wanted to do in the first place. And I'm regularly surprised by how often people can't answer that question. And so the reason that comes back to evaluation research and becomes the dark side, not through the fault of the evaluator, but then you end up with what I call sort of navel-gazing evaluation research, which is we're now going to look at what we think would be a good story to close out this project, which is what were we trying to do in the first place, and how well do we do that? And the darkest side of that is the failure to learn from that kind of evaluation, because you can't apply that in any way for the next project and the next project, because it is simply a check-the-box situation. So I see the formative research is a huge component. And then the other thing I'll say, maybe in an inconvenient place, I was once a program officer myself at a foundation a long time ago, and so I understand the grant-making process and the programmatic sense of that. And it's not funded appropriately, evaluation or formative research. And I'm going back to formative research on this, because if funders were pushing and requiring, and this might be inconvenient, requiring at least the appropriate amount of thought, at least on my side of it, storytelling for social change, which I know is different from on the ground programmatic work. We, as a sort of ecosystem around that world, could be much more effective, because we, the big generic we, would really be forced to grapple with those questions before we get into a phase where we say, what can I write in this report that I think would be good for a donor to see? And so I think a realistic sense of what it costs to actually do this, well, besides experimental design, but what it costs, if we don't deal with that as people who do evaluation and do programs designed for social impact, et cetera, is what I've seen happen is that a lot of times we have people who are not well trained in this space, who are trying to do these sort of DIY things, and then that gets back to the very first thing that I started with, which is we have these sort of vanity metrics that you can't ever apply to other projects, and so what's the point? So,
well, on that note, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, last word, Ehren. Why don't you? What do you say to that?
Entirely agree. Formative is part of my looking towards the future. I just happened to mention the experiments that people are running, but that should be part and parcel of taking a look out your front door before you decide what jacket to wear. And yes, I agree also that it's not funded appropriately. That it's probably not enough, and it's probably directed in not the most productive ways. So couldn't agree more. But just in a happy way, rather than we're screwed.
Perfect. Well, guys, thank you very much. Thank all of you for being here.